The Mississippi Delta doesn't scream. It rots. Quietly. In August of 1927, the water receded, but it left behind a silence that felt heavier than the flood itself. The air was a wet blanket, sitting at 90% humidity, carrying the smell of dead fish and ancient mud. Noah stood on the edge of 40 acres that the county clerk had laughed about when he signed the deed. They called it the Bottoms, a worthless stretch of stagnant swamp where the mosquitoes were thick enough to breathe. He had no money. He had no shelter, and the mud beneath his boots was baking into a concrete crust that would break a plow. Most men looked at that mud and saw a grave. Noah looked past it. 300 yards away, the river was moving. To understand what he did next, you have to understand what lay beneath that mud. You have to go back to the days of the Great Raft, when the timber barons stripped the North American continent of its old-growth forests. They floated millions of tons of cypress down the river highways. But cypress is heavy. It drinks water. And when the rafts broke apart or the logs grew waterlogged, they didn't float to the mill. They sank. For 50 years, the river bottom had been collecting a fortune in lost timber. Sinker cypress, the old-timers called it. But in the delta mud, something strange happens to wood. It doesn't rot. The science is simple, even if the work wasn't. Deep in that muck, the environment is anaerobic. There is no oxygen. Without oxygen, the bacteria that eat wood can't survive. The river had created a perfect preservation chamber, sealing the logs in a tomb of silt and clay. Noah spent his first week not building, but hunting. He fashioned a 12-foot iron rod, sharpening one end to a needlepoint. He walked the swamp in chest-deep sludge, driving the rod down into the mire. Thud. That was mud. Thud. That was a rock. Clunk. That was money. When the rod hit solid wood, the vibration traveled up the iron and into his hands. It was a feeling of connection to a century past. He would dive then, holding his breath against the black water, digging blindly with his hands until he found the purchase of a chain. Hauling a 2-ton log out of the suction of the riverbed is a lesson in leverage. He used a Spanish windlass, a simple capstan made of rope and a lever arm, to multiply his strength. Inch by agonizing inch, the logs broke the surface. They were ugly on the outside, gray and slimed with algae. But when he took a draw knife to the bark, the wood underneath was startling. It was the color of honey and smelled like turpentine. This was the secret of the cypress. The heartwood is saturated with an oil called cypressine. It's a natural fungicide and insecticide. Termites won't touch it. Water can't penetrate it. You could build a house out of this wood and leave it unpainted for 100 years, and it would still be standing when your grandchildren were old. The village saw a desperate man playing in the mud. Noah saw it differently. He wasn't just scavenging lumber. He was mining a foundation. Stone sinks in the delta. Concrete cracks as the clay expands and contracts. But a raft of sinker cypress? That was a foundation that would float. He had the materials now. He had the logs stacked on the only patch of dry ground he could find, curing in the sun. But materials don't make a home. The heat was still rising, the air was still dead, and the swamp was still a stagnant pool of disease waiting to claim him. He looked at his pile of wood, then he looked at the dead water around his ankles. He realized then that the problem wasn't the water itself. The problem was that it wasn't moving. The village had exactly one opinion on the matter. They watched Noah from the safety of the levee road, shaking their heads as he marched out into the heat with a shovel and a pick. They figured he was digging a drainage ditch, a futile attempt to dry out a swamp that had been wet since the beginning of time. When they realized he wasn't digging a drain out, but a channel in, towards the main artery of the river, the betting shifted. They didn't wonder if he would fail. They wondered how long it would take for him to drown himself. They saw a man digging his own grave. Noah saw a hydraulic engineering project. He understood something about the delta that the farmers missed. You cannot fight the water. You have to invite it. His swamp was dead because it had no pulse. The water sat still, cooking in the sun, breeding mosquitoes and rot. But 300 yards to the west, the river was alive. It had mass, it had velocity, and most importantly, it had kinetic potential. Noah didn't just need water for drinking or washing. He needed the weight of the river to do work. He needed to borrow the river's energy. The labor was a brutal education in geology. The soil here was gumbo clay, a dense, sticky substance that defies tools. When dry, it is hard as concrete. When wet, it clings to steel like tar. Noah had to keep a bucket of oil next to him, greasing his spade every 10 minutes just to get the dirt to slide off the blade. He worked in the twilight hours to escape the worst of the sun, but the humidity wrapped around him like wet wool. Swing, strike, lift, throw. It was a rhythm that dissolved muscle and will. He moved tons of earth, one shovel load at a time, carving a channel 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep through the scrub brush and palmettos. But this wasn't random digging. It was a matter of geometry. Noah had to calculate the grade without a surveyor's transit or a theodolite. He used a long board and a shallow pan of water to find his level, sighting along the surface of the water to measure the drop. He needed a specific slope, exactly 4 inches of drop for every 100 feet of run. This ratio was critical. If he dug the channel too steep, the water would rush in with too much violence, creating turbulent flow that would undercut the banks and wash away his land. If he dug it too shallow, the water would move too slowly, allowing silt to settle and clogging the intake within a week. He needed a race, a channel designed to induce a laminar flow, smooth and consistent. He was aiming for a current speed of 3 knots, fast enough to scour the bottom clean, but slow enough to control. The risk was absolute. The river was swollen from the spring rains. If he dug the intake point too deep, he wouldn't just fill the channel. He would invite the entire weight of the Mississippi into his 40 acres. He would flood the very land he was trying to save. He left a 10-foot plug of natural clay at the riverbank, a temporary dam holding back the millions of gallons of water pressing against the earth. It took him 3 weeks of relentless labor to cut the 300-yard scar across the landscape. When the channel was clean, the sides shored up with woven willow branches to prevent erosion, he walked to the riverbank for the final time. He stood on the plug of clay. On one side was the roaring, brown muscle of the river. On the other, his dry, empty ditch waiting for a pulse. He didn't use a shovel for the breach. He used a pickaxe. He started at the top, chipping away the clay, letting the river taste the new path. The water didn't rush in like a tidal wave. It started as a dark bleed against the gray clay, a trickle that turned into a stream. Then the pressure took over. The clay wall collapsed inward with a wet slump. Noah scrambled up the bank and watched. The brown water surged into the cut, chasing the dust and dry leaves down the straightaway. It hit the stagnant pool in the swamp with a force that churned up decades of rot. The green layer of algae broke apart, swirling into the new current. The smell of sulfur released into the air, slowly replaced by the smell of wet earth and moving water. In 20 minutes, the water level stabilized. The dead swamp was gone. In its place was a harbor with a steady 3-knot current running right through the center. He had given the land a heartbeat. Now, he had to build something that could survive the pulse. The water was moving, but Noah had a new problem. The ground was soup. You can't pour concrete on pudding. If he built a cabin on the bank, the next flood would undercut it. If he built it on stilts, the mud would shift and snap them like matchsticks. The delta doesn't like permanence. It wants everything to move. So Noah decided to let it. He wasn't going to build a house that stood still. He was going to build a house that pivoted. The heart of the design was the spindle. He needed a central axis, a single point of absolute stability that the rest of the structure would revolve around. He didn't order a steel pylon from a catalog. He went into the uplands and found a white oak. Not just any oak. He looked for a tree that had grown slow and hard in crowded timber, straight as a rifle barrel, with grain tight enough to turn a nail. He felled it, stripped the bark, and seasoned it over a fire until the surface was carbonized, a primitive heat treatment to armor the wood against rot. Getting it into the ground was a feat of leverage. He rigged a tripod of cypress poles over the center of his new harbor. Using a heavy iron block as a drop hammer, he drove that oak trunk into the riverbed. 5 feet, 10 feet, 20. He was driving it through the soft alluvial silt, searching for the hard pan, the layer of compressed clay that sits deep beneath the delta like a buried floor. When the hammer struck and the log bounced instead of sinking, he knew he'd hit bottom. He had his anchor. 30 feet of white oak, locked into the earth, standing proud of the waterline. Now came the mechanics. How do you make a 20-ton house rotate? You don't use ball bearings. They rust. You don't use complex gears. They jam. You use what the pioneers used. Noah salvaged the wheel hub from a derelict heavy haul wagon, a massive casting of iron designed to carry loads of cotton. He mounted the hub on the top of his oak spindle. For lubrication, he didn't use oil that would wash away. He used rendered animal tallow mixed with graphite. It was a thick, black paste that would stay slick for years, even underwater. Around this iron pivot, he began to assemble the raft. This is where the sinker cypress logs found their purpose. He didn't cut them into boards yet. He used them whole. He lashed them together in a radial pattern, like the spokes of a giant wheel, with the iron hub at the center. He used iron drift pins to lock the timbers, driving them through the wood with a sledgehammer until the metal heads were buried deep in the grain. He was working with Archimedes' principle. He calculated the displacement. A cubic foot of dry cypress weighs about 30 pounds. A cubic foot of water weighs 62. That meant every cubic foot of wood he submerged gave him 32 pounds of lift. He wasn't building a boat. He was building a floating foundation. He needed enough displacement to support not just the platform, but the walls, the roof, and the life he intended to live inside. He chained the logs, chinking the gaps with pitch and oakum, creating a solid deck that hovered just above the surface of the channel. The heat during those weeks was a physical weight. The sun hammered down on the unfinished deck, raising the temperature of the wood until it was hot to the touch. The air shimmered. But as Noah stood on the platform, he felt something shift. The wake of a passing barge on the main river sent a ripple down his feeder canal. The wave hit the raft. The timber groaned, a low, deep sound of wood rubbing against wood, and the ground beneath his feet shifted. It didn't crack. It didn't sink. It rose. The platform rode the swell, lifting 3 inches and settling back down. It was floating. It was anchored. But it was still just a dead raft baking in the sun. To survive the summer, he needed it to do more than float. He needed it to turn. The platform was the body. Now, he had to build the engine. Noah wasn't the first man to look at a muddy river and see a workhorse. He was pulling from a lineage of forgotten mechanics, the floating millwrights of the 19th century, who had once lined the Ohio and the Mississippi with barges that ground corn using nothing but the current. Those men were gone, pushed out by coal and steam, but their physics remained valid. Energy is energy, whether it comes from a boiler or a bayou. He built the wheel from cedar. He couldn't use the sinker cypress for this. It was too dense, too heavy. A wheel made of cypress would have acted like a counterweight, causing the entire floating platform to list aggressively to one side. He needed something buoyant but durable. He found his material in the form of old fence posts and siding scavenged from a derelict barn on the high ground. Cedar is light, brittle if you mistreat it, but it possesses a chemical bitterness that fungi despise. It would survive the wet-dry cycle that rots lesser woods in a season. The construction took place on the deck of his floating raft. Noah laid out the geometry with charcoal on the planks. The wheel would be 10 feet in diameter. A circle that size is unforgiving. If you miss your center by an inch, the wobble will eventually tear the bearing apart. He built the spokes first, lapping them over each other at the hub, creating a rigid star. For the blades, he faced a choice: curved buckets or flat paddles. A curved bucket is efficient. It catches the water and holds it, extracting the maximum kinetic energy. But curved buckets trap debris. In the delta, the water carries a soup of driftwood, water hyacinth, and silt. A complex bucket would clog in an hour. Noah chose flat paddles, wide, blunt boards designed to slap the water and keep moving. He wasn't building a watch, he was building a tractor. The math behind the power was deceptive. The channel current was running at a steady 3 knots. To a layman, 3 knots is a lazy walking pace. It seems gentle. But water is 800 times denser than air. A 3-knot wind can't blow out a candle. A 3-knot current can crush a hull. Noah calculated the torque based on leverage. His 10-foot wheel gave him a 5-foot lever arm. When a paddle with 15 square feet of surface area dipped into that heavy, moving water, it wasn't catching a breeze. It was catching tons of mass every second. The RPM would be low, painfully slow, but the torque would be enough to twist a steel driveshaft in half if the house got stuck. Installation was a game of inches. He used a block and tackle rigged to the central oak spindle to hoist the wheel over the side. He lowered it into the race, the cedar paddles splashing into the brown water. He felt the immediate jerk on the ropes. The river wanted to take the wheel. It was alive. The final step was the transmission. A spinning wheel on the side of a boat does nothing but spin. Noah had to translate that rotation into torque that could turn the entire 40-ton platform. He fashioned a simple reduction drive using a salvaged bull gear from a cotton gin. He mounted the small pinion gear on the wheel's axle and fixed the large ring gear to the stationary central spindle, the dead oak tree that anchored the house. It was a planetary arrangement. The water wheel would turn, driving the pinion, which would walk around the fixed central gear, dragging the entire house with it. He finished the linkage at noon on a Tuesday. The heat was oppressive, the air still and suffocating. The wheel was locked in place with a wooden chock, the water foaming angrily around the submerged paddles, desperate to push them downstream. Noah didn't make a speech. He didn't break a bottle of champagne. He simply walked to the edge of the deck and kicked the chock away. There was a groan. It was the sound of wood compressing against wood, a deep structural complaint that vibrated through the soles of his boots. The wheel shuddered as the first paddle took the full weight of the river. It turned. 1 foot. 2 feet. The pinion gear bit into the teeth of the central ring. For a moment, nothing happened. The inertia of the house fought the torque of the river. Then, the horizon shifted. A cypress tree on the far bank, which had been framed in the center of the doorway, slowly slid to the right. The floorboards creaked. The entire world began to rotate counterclockwise. It wasn't fast. It was a glacial, steady movement. But as the wheel picked up its rhythm, finding the cadence of the current, the house settled into a slow, inexorable spin. The river was no longer just passing by. It was working. The movement wasn't just for show. In the Mississippi Delta, a static house is an oven. By July, the ambient temperature hits 100 degrees before noon. The humidity locks that heat against the ground, creating a pressure cooker that doesn't cool down when the sun sets. In 1927, without electricity, air conditioning was a fantasy. People didn't sleep. They lay in pools of their own sweat, praying for a breeze that never came. Stagnant air wasn't just uncomfortable. In a swamp, it was lethal. Noah had built a machine to generate its own weather. The rotation of the house, driven by the river, did more than offer a changing view. It turned the entire structure into a low-velocity centrifugal pump. He had designed the layout based on the dog trot cabins of the uplands, 2 rooms separated by a wide, open central breezeway. But where a standard dog trot relied on luck to catch the wind, Noah's house manufactured it. He built the windows as scoops. They weren't flat panes of glass. They were vertical shutters, hinged to swing outward, catching the air as the house turned into the still atmosphere. This is where the physics took over. He was utilizing the Venturi effect, a principle of fluid dynamics that says when a fluid, in this case air, is forced through a constricted section of pipe, its pressure drops and its velocity increases. As the house rotated, the wide mouths of the window scoops captured the stagnant air. That air was then funneled into the narrower interior rooms and the central breezeway. The constriction forced the air to speed up. Even on a day when the leaves on the trees were dead still, a steady, cooling draft moved through Noah's kitchen. It was a constant, man-made breeze, pulling the heat off the walls and pushing it out the back. But the cooling went deeper than just airflow. Because the house sat directly on the water, the air entering the floor vents was pre-cooled. The river, constantly churning from the undershot wheel, acted as a massive heat sink. As the hot delta air moved over the wet logs of the foundation and the cool surface of the channel, it surrendered its heat to the water. It was evaporative cooling on an architectural scale. The difference was physical and immediate. While the thermometer nailed to the oak tree on the bank read 102 degrees, the interior of the floating cabin held steady at 75. It felt like walking into a cave. The air inside was moving, dry and cool. Noah could sleep under a sheet while the rest of the county suffocated. The rotation changed the psychology of living in the swamp. In a fixed house, the sun beats on the same wall for hours, baking the heat into the timber. Noah's house never gave the sun a stationary target. The solar load was distributed evenly, dissipating before it could penetrate the insulation. Time wasn't measured by a clock on the wall, but by the view out the window. Breakfast was eaten facing the sunrise over the willows. Lunch was served looking at the main river channel. By dinner, the kitchen was facing the cool shadows of the deep swamp. The house completed a full revolution every hour, a slow, hypnotic clock that kept pace with the river. There was one final, critical benefit to this artificial wind. The Delta's most efficient killer isn't the heat, it's the mosquito. Malaria and yellow fever were still very real threats in the 20s. But a mosquito is a weak flyer. It cannot navigate in a breeze stronger than 2 miles per hour. The rotation of the house, combined with the Venturi acceleration through the breezeway, created an air barrier that insects couldn't breach. While the village was slapping at clouds of biting pests, Noah sat on his porch in peace. The mosquitoes would hover at the edge of the platform, buffeted by the draft, unable to land. He had built a sanctuary in the middle of a plague. The village stopped laughing. They started stopping their trucks on the levee road, watching the strange, square shape slowly pirouetting on the water. They saw the undershot wheel churning, the house turning, and the man sitting on his porch, cool and dry. He had solved the summer. But the Delta has 2 seasons, the burning and the drowning. The heat was manageable. The water was about to remind him who really owned the land. The seasons in the Delta do not transition politely. They collide. In late February, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum, and the rain began. It didn't stop for 6 days. But the rain wasn't the real threat. The threat was gravity pulling the runoff from half a continent, from the Ohio, the Missouri, the Arkansas, down into the funnel of the lower Mississippi. The river didn't just rise, it swelled like an infected limb. The high water is a specific kind of terror in the lowlands. It exerts a force called hydrostatic pressure. For the farmers with fixed cabins along the levee road, this pressure was an invisible vice. As the water table saturated the ground, the clay expanded. It pushed against concrete foundations with thousands of pounds of force per square inch. You could hear the houses dying in the night, the sharp crack of a masonry footing snapping, the groan of a timber frame twisting as the earth beneath it turned to soup. Men spent their days filling sandbags, fighting a losing war against a river that had decided to reclaim its floodplain. They were trying to hold back the ocean with burlap sacks. Noah didn't fill a single sandbag. He watched the water level in his feeder channel inch up the bank. It covered the roots of the willow trees. It swallowed the muddy beach where he had landed the sinker cypress logs. And then it reached the house. A conventional home fights the flood. It stands its ground until the water breaks it. Noah's house accepted the water. As the brown tide surrounded the platform, the physics of buoyancy took over. The massive raft of sinker cypress, displacing tons of water, simply obeyed the law of Archimedes. It didn't flood. It lifted. The central oak spindle, that 30-foot shaft driven into the hardpan, became the only fixed point in a moving world. The iron hub, greased with its heavy coat of tallow and graphite, slid upward along the trunk. It was a floating collar. As the river rose 5 feet, the house rose 5 feet. The floor remained level. The interior remained dry. The undershot wheel, attached to the floating frame, rose with the current, maintaining its perfect depth in the water, continuing to turn, continuing to generate power, even as the world drowned. But the flood brought violence. The river was carrying the wreckage of the north, uprooted trees, pieces of barns, dead livestock. The channel Noah had dug was no longer a calm harbor. It was a catch basin for debris. On the 3rd night, the storm peaked. The wind was howling at 40 miles an hour, whipping the floodwaters into whitecaps. Out of the darkness came a battering ram, a massive cottonwood log, 40 feet long and jagged, riding the current like a torpedo. It bypassed the deflection boom and slammed into the upstream corner of the house. In a stick-built house, that impact would have shattered the wall studs and collapsed the roof. But Noah wasn't floating on pine 2x4s. He was floating on old-growth sinker cypress. The log hit the raft with a sound like a cannon shot. The house shuddered. The iron hub groaned against the oak spindle. But the sinker cypress didn't splinter. It is wood that has been tempered by a century of compression. It is denser than the drift log that struck it. The cottonwood bounced off, its bark stripped away by the impact, and spun harmlessly downstream. The house absorbed the kinetic energy, rotated slightly on its axis to shed the blow, and settled back into its rhythm. The next morning, the rain broke. The villagers, exhausted and wet, stood on the high ground of the levee. They looked out over the drowned landscape, expecting to see wreckage. They expected to see Noah's foolish experiment smashed against the trees or sunk in the mud. Instead, they saw a miracle of engineering. The water was 6 feet above flood stage, covering the fences and the roads. But out in the middle of the new lake, the house was sitting comfortably, high and dry. It was rotating slowly, turning its face to the morning sun. Smoke was curling gently from the chimney. That night, the power failed in the town. The lines were down, snapped by falling branches. The levee road was pitch black, save for the lightning flashing in the south. But out on the water, there was a single, steady light. It was the warm glow of a kerosene lamp in Noah's window. And because the house was turning, the light acted like a beacon. Every hour, it swept across the darkness, a slow, rhythmic flash visible for miles. It was a signal that didn't just say, "I am here." It said that while the rest of the world was fighting the river, one man was dancing with it. The water receded weeks later, but the silence from the levee was different this time. It wasn't the silence of mockery. It was the silence of men who realized they had been building the wrong kind of walls. The floodwaters eventually retreated. It wasn't a quick exit. The Mississippi takes its time. But as the brown water drained back into the main channel, Noah's house did exactly what it was designed to do. Gravity took over from buoyancy. The massive iron hub slid back down the greased oak spindle. The sinker cypress raft settled into the mud with a wet sigh. When the ground finally dried, the house was sitting exactly where it had started, level and true. No cracked foundation, no warped floorboards, just a ring of silt on the pilings to mark the high water line. Then came the men in the suits. It was late spring when the county surveyor and a tax assessor drove their Ford Model A down the rutted levee road. They were company men, carrying clipboards and the heavy arrogance of bureaucracy. They had come to reassess the value of the bottoms. In their ledger, this was wasteland, taxable only for its timber potential. They expected to find a squatter in a lean-to, someone they could easily evict or exploit. Instead, they found a machine for living. They stood on the bank, sweating in their wool jackets, watching the house rotate in the silence of the swamp. They saw the undershot wheel turning without a motor. They felt the cool breeze rushing out of the breezeway, smelling of cedar and river water. The assessor walked across the gangplank, testing the wood with his heel, looking for rot that wasn't there. He asked Noah how he planned to pay the property taxes on a permanent structure of this size. Noah didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just pointed at the water. He asked them a simple question of law. Does a boat pay property tax? The house wasn't on the land. It was floating on a navigable waterway that he had dug himself. It was, legally speaking, a vessel. It had a hull. It had propulsion. It just happened to be shaped like a cabin and never went anywhere. The assessor looked at the spindle, then at the water, then at his ledger. He didn't have a code for a rotating amphibious dwelling. He closed the book. They listed the improvement value as 0. The worthless swamp remained worthless on paper, even while it supported the most advanced home in the county. This was the lesson that the Delta tried to teach everyone, though few listened. The Army Corps of Engineers spent millions building higher levees, fighting the river with concrete and geometry. They tried to constrain the energy. Noah used it. He understood that resilience isn't about being harder than the force hitting you. It's about being fluid. The levee breaks because it is rigid. The willow tree survives the flood because it bends. Noah's house survived because it refused to stand still. The house stood for 40 years. It rotated through the Great Depression, through the war, and into the era of rural electrification. Noah lived there until his knees could no longer manage the gangplank. He never installed an electric fan. He never bought an air conditioner. The river provided everything he needed. Eventually, time won. It always does. The central white oak spindle, despite the charring and the tallow, finally succumbed to 40 years of friction and underwater decay. In the winter of 1967, during a minor storm, the spindle snapped at the mudline. The house didn't sink, but it stopped turning. It drifted against the bank, becoming just another stationary cabin in the swamp. Without the rotation, the breeze stopped. The heat returned. The mosquitoes came back. The swamp reclaimed the wood, pulling the cypress logs back into the mud from which they came. The heartbeat of the undershot wheel fell silent. But the physics remain. There is no such thing as worthless land. There is only a lack of vision. Noah looked at a stagnant pool and saw a power source. He looked at a flood and saw an elevator. He looked at the mud and saw a foundation. Look at the dead water in your own life, the resources you've written off. The energy is there. You just have to dig the channel. For more accounts of American resilience and the engineering of survival, subscribe.